They found the cabin door wide open. The food was still warm on the stove. The car was still in the driveway. But the 4 people who had gone up there for the weekend were never seen again. Not a single one of them. And what investigators discovered inside that cabin changed the way they looked at isolated places forever. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share with you tonight is not for the faint of heart. Welcome. If you are new here, this is Faith and Fear, the place where we go deep into the stories that most people are too afraid to tell out loud. Tonight we have 4 of them. 4 real accounts. 4 isolated cabins. 4 groups of people who went in and never came back out. Before we get into the first story, do me a quick favor and hit that like button right now. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We put out content like this every week, and I promise you, you do not want to miss what's coming. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. There is something about a cabin in the woods that does something to the human mind. It pulls at a part of us that is ancient, that still remembers what it felt like to live far away from everything, surrounded by trees and silence, and the kind of darkness that doesn't exist in cities anymore. We romanticize it. We put it on our bucket lists. We book weekends away, and we tell ourselves it's going to be peaceful and restorative and exactly what we need. And most of the time it is. Most of the time. People go up, they breathe the clean air, they sit around the fire, they come back home with photos and stories, and a general feeling of having recharged, most of the time. But sometimes, the cabin is the last place they ever see. And sometimes, the story that gets left behind is one that nobody can fully explain. Tonight, I'm going to take you through 4 of those stories. I want to be upfront with you. These accounts are drawn from real missing persons cases, real investigations, real survivor testimonies, and real documentation. Some names have been changed to protect families who are still looking for answers. But the events, the details, the chilling facts at the center of each of these stories are as real as the ground underneath your feet right now. Let's start with the first one. The first story takes place in the fall of 2009 in a remote stretch of forest in northern Minnesota, not far from the Canadian border. The area is known for its long winters, its dense forests, and its near total absence of cell phone signal. People go up there to fish, to hunt, and to disappear from the noise of everyday life. In October of that year, a group of 5 friends decided to spend a long weekend at a rental cabin that sat at the end of a 6-mile dirt road. The cabin had no internet, no phone line, and the nearest town was roughly 40 minutes away by car, assuming the roads were clear. The group consisted of 3 men and 2 women, all in their late 20s. For the purposes of this story, we'll call them Marcus, Derek, Joel, Caitlin, and Sarah. They had known each other since college. This was supposed to be their annual reunion trip, something they had done every fall for the past 3 years. Marcus had found the cabin through a listing on a small local tourism website. The price was cheap, which he mentioned in the group chat. $40 a night for the whole cabin. That detail will matter later. He had spoken to the owner over email a few times, a man who signed his messages simply as R. Holden. The communication had been brief and functional. Directions to the property, instructions for where to find the key. A reminder that there was no generator, so flashlights were necessary after dark. And a single line at the bottom of the final email that none of the friends paid much attention to at the time. The line read, "Please stay on the marked paths after nightfall." At the time Marcus showed them that email, Derek had laughed and said it sounded like the beginning of a horror movie. Everybody laughed. They piled into 2 cars and drove north. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in October, just as the light was beginning to go golden and long through the trees. By all accounts, the cabin was beautiful. It was old, built sometime in the 1940s, according to a small plaque near the door, and it had the kind of worn-in charm that you can't manufacture. A stone fireplace, thick log walls, a wraparound porch that looked out over a small clearing, and beyond that, the tree line. Caitlin had taken photos almost immediately upon arrival and had posted them to her social media before they lost signal. Those photos would later be used by investigators trying to piece together the timeline. In one of the photos, you can see all 5 of them on the porch, drinks in hand, laughing. It is the last known photograph of all 5 of them together. The first night was unremarkable in most ways. They made dinner. They built a fire. They talked late into the night the way old friends do, catching up on jobs and relationships and all the mundane progress of adult life. At some point around midnight, Joel stepped outside to use the outhouse, which was a separate small structure about 30 feet behind the cabin. When he came back inside, he was quieter than he had been, and Caitlin noticed it. She asked him if he was okay, and he said yes, but that he thought he had heard something moving in the trees. Something big. Derek told him it was probably a deer. Minnesota had a large deer population. Joel said, yeah, probably. They went to bed. The cabin had 2 bedrooms and a couch. Marcus and Caitlin were a couple and took 1 bedroom. Sarah took the other. Derek and Joel shared the pull-out couch in the main room. This too will matter later. Saturday passed normally. They spent the day hiking on a trail that followed the edge of a small lake about a mile from the cabin. The trail was marked with orange paint on the trees, and they stayed on it the entire time. They saw deer tracks and bird life and the kind of dense October forest that looks like it belongs in a painting. By the time they got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, they were tired and happy and starting to talk about where to go for dinner, since there was a bar and grill in the nearest town that the listing had mentioned. In the end, they decided to stay in and cook. Sarah made pasta. They ate early. Marcus started the fire again. Everything was good. Everything was fine. It was Derek who first mentioned the noise around 9 o'clock that Saturday night. He had gone outside to get more firewood from the stack on the side of the cabin, and when he came back in, he set the wood down and stood there for a moment with an expression that Caitlin would later describe as something between confusion and unease. He said he had heard something while he was outside. Not an animal sound, not wind. He said it sounded like someone was walking slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. Not running, not stumbling, walking, slowly and deliberately, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. Marcus went outside with a flashlight to check. He walked around the entire cabin. He found nothing. No tracks in the soft dirt that he could identify as human. No sign of anyone. He came back in and told everyone it was probably an animal. Joel, who had heard something the night before, didn't say anything. He just nodded and stared at the fire. What happened that night, in the early hours of Sunday morning, is where the story gets harder to tell. The only person who survived to describe it in any detail is Sarah, who was in the second bedroom. What she remembers is waking up to a sound she initially couldn't identify. A low, rhythmic sound. Almost like breathing, but too slow and too deep to be normal. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening. Then she heard what she described as a knock. Not on the front door, on her bedroom wall. From the outside. A single, deliberate knock, low down on the wall, near the ground. She told investigators she immediately thought of the email. Stay on the marked paths after nightfall. She reached for her phone out of habit, and then remembered there was no signal. She got up and went to the door of her bedroom and opened it. The main room was dark. The fire had burned down to embers. She could make out the shape of the pull-out couch, but she could not tell if Derek and Joel were on it. She called their names softly. No answer. She called again, louder this time. Still nothing. She crossed the room and reached the couch and put her hand out and felt nothing. The blankets were there. The pillows were there. The two men were not. She stood in the middle of the room in the dark, her heart hammering, and she heard it again. That slow walking sound from outside, going around the cabin, slowly, deliberately, like before. Sarah did not go outside. She made a decision in that moment that she has said, in the years since, she believes saved her life. She went back to her bedroom, closed and braced the door with the small wooden chair that was in the corner. And she lay down on the bed, and she did not move, and she did not make a sound for the rest of the night. She said she heard things. She heard what she thought might have been voices, though she could never make out words. She heard the walking continue, circling the cabin, for what felt like hours. And then at some point, she heard nothing at all. And then it was morning. When she came out of her room in the daylight, Marcus and Caitlin's bedroom door was open. Their bed was empty. The front door of the cabin was standing open. She went outside, and the two cars were still in the gravel area in front of the cabin. She screamed their names until her voice gave out. She waited an hour, and then she got in Marcus's car and drove the 6 miles to the main road, and then the 40 minutes to town, and walked into the sheriff's office and told them everything she could. Search teams went out that afternoon. They combed the area around the cabin for 3 days. They found no sign of Marcus, Derek, Joel, or Caitlin. No blood, no clothing, no tracks that led anywhere definitive. The 4 of them had simply ceased to exist sometime between Saturday night and Sunday morning in a cabin at the end of a 6-mile dirt road in northern Minnesota. Investigators attempted to contact R. Holden, the owner of the cabin listed in the rental agreement. The email address Marcus had used to communicate with him bounced back as undeliverable. The website where the listing had appeared was taken down within days of the disappearances being reported. Local records showed the cabin was owned by an entity called Holden Land Management, which had been registered in the 1980s and listed no current active officers or contact information. The last property tax payment on record had been made in 2006, 3 years before the group's visit. To this day, the cabin sits at the end of that 6-mile dirt road. The county has tried twice to have it condemned and demolished. Both times the proceedings stalled due to unclear ownership. And the 4 friends, Marcus, Derek, Joel, and Caitlin, remain among the thousands of people who go missing in remote areas of the United States every year and are never found. Sarah still does not go into the woods. She has never gone back, and she has said in interviews that the thing she thinks about most, the thing that keeps her awake on bad nights, is not what she heard. It's the email. Stay on the marked paths after nightfall. Someone knew. Someone who sent that email knew that the dark out there was not just dark. Let's take a breath before we move into the second story, because the second one is different in a way that makes it almost harder to process. The first story is terrifying because of what we don't know. The second story is terrifying because of what we do. There are records. There is documented evidence. There were cameras. The second story comes from the Appalachian region of West Virginia, from a deeply rural area known locally as Harker's Hollow. The name is not on most maps. It's the kind of name that local people use to refer to a stretch of land that has its own character, its own history, its own reputation. And Harker's Hollow had a reputation. The people who had lived in that part of West Virginia for generations knew not to spend nights out in the hollow. It was one of those pieces of folk wisdom that doesn't come with an explanation, just with a tone of voice that makes you understand that the explanation isn't something anyone wants to sit down and discuss. Don't spend the night in the hollow. That was the rule. It had been the rule for as long as anyone could remember. In the summer of 2014, a documentary filmmaker named Thomas Warwick became interested in the folklore of Harker's Hollow. He was 31 years old, based out of Charleston, and had made a small name for himself with a documentary about coal mining communities that had received some local festival attention. He was working on a new project about Appalachian folklore and superstition, and a contact in the region had pointed him toward the stories surrounding the hollow. Thomas went up there in June of 2014 for an initial visit, driving a beat-up Subaru up roads that got narrower and less paved the further he went. He talked to a handful of local residents, most of whom would not speak on camera. One elderly woman, referred to in Thomas's notes as Mrs. P, agreed to speak with him briefly, but refused to give her name or show her face. She told him there was a cabin at the center of the hollow, an old hunting cabin that had been abandoned since the 1970s, and that the cabin was where the stories started. Thomas was intrigued. He arranged a second trip for August, this time bringing 2 colleagues with him. The first was a sound technician and editor named Paul Gregg, who was 28. The second was a production assistant named Jess Alderton, who was 24. The 3 of them planned to spend 4 nights at the abandoned cabin, documenting the location, capturing audio and video, and hopefully collecting enough material for a compelling segment of Thomas's documentary. They brought significant equipment. Several cameras including a night vision-capable unit, audio recorders, a drone for aerial footage, and enough food and water for 5 days. They told friends and family where they were going and gave a rough date for their return. They drove up into Harker's Hollow on a Tuesday in early August of 2014 and were not heard from again. What makes this case different from many others is that their equipment was eventually found. 6 weeks after they were reported missing, a hunter making his way through the hollow came across a weathered bag, partially concealed by leaves and brush, near a creek bed, about 2 miles from the cabin. Inside the bag were 3 of the cameras, 2 audio recorders, and a portable hard drive. The equipment was damaged by moisture, but a significant amount of footage and audio was recovered. That recovered material was reviewed by law enforcement, by the families of the missing, and by a small number of investigators, whose accounts of what the material contained have been shared in bits and pieces over the years. No charges were ever filed. The case remains officially open. The footage itself has never been released to the public, and the families have requested that it remain private. But the accounts of what it showed have been described enough times, in enough detail, by enough people who actually saw it, that a picture has emerged. The first day and a half of footage was normal documentary material, Thomas narrating to camera about the history of the hollow. The 3 of them navigating the trail to the cabin, their arrival and setup, early exploration of the cabin's interior. The cabin was in poor condition, partially collapsed on one side, with evidence of animal habitation throughout. They found old newspaper pages from 1971 still stuck to one wall as makeshift insulation. They found a rusted wood stove. They found, in the back room of the cabin, a set of initials carved into the wall, alongside what appeared to be a series of tally marks. The tally marks were interesting to Thomas, who filmed them closely and speculated on camera that they might represent days spent there by a previous occupant. The marks were arranged in groups of 4. with a fifth line crossing through each group. There were 11 complete groups, and then 3 additional marks that were not crossed. 11 weeks and 3 days. That was how Thomas interpreted it. Paul suggested it might mean something else entirely. Jess said she just wanted to eat dinner. The audio from the second night is where things shifted. The audio recorders had been placed outside the cabin as part of their documentation setup, and the recording from that night captured approximately 40 minutes of what has been described as an unidentifiable sound occurring at a low frequency. Occurring at irregular but frequent intervals, always from the same general direction, somewhere in the trees to the north of the cabin. The investigators who reviewed the audio described it as not matching any known wildlife sound for that region. One investigator described it as sounding structured, with pauses that seemed responsive, like one half of a conversation. The 3 filmmakers apparently heard it too, because the audio from inside the cabin, which was being captured by a separate recorder, picks up Thomas and Paul discussing it in low voices around 2 in the morning. Thomas is heard saying he wants to go out and try to get it on camera. Paul is heard saying he doesn't think that's a good idea. Jess is not heard in this exchange. When Paul asks where she is, Thomas says she went to get water from the cooler outside. A moment of silence follows, and then the sound of both of them moving quickly toward the cabin door. The next piece of footage on the timeline is from the night vision camera, which had been left on a tripod facing the tree line. It captured something approaching the cabin from the north. The investigators who reviewed this footage have been extremely careful about how they describe it. The word used most often is figure. A figure moving through the trees at the edge of what the night vision camera could see. The figure moved slowly. It moved in a way that one investigator described as too deliberate to be accidental, meaning it did not appear to be wandering. It appeared to be approaching with intention. The footage does not show the figure clearly enough to make a definitive identification. What it does show is that the figure stopped at the tree line. It stood at the edge of the trees for a long period of time. The timestamp on the footage shows it stood there for 17 minutes. Then the footage ends because the battery on that camera died. Jess was found by the door of the cabin in the morning. According to the official report, she was unharmed physically and was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest. She was unresponsive when Thomas and Paul found her, though she was breathing. They spent what appears to have been approximately 2 hours trying to get her to respond, offering water, speaking to her, touching her shoulder. Eventually she did respond, but what she said was not captured clearly on the audio. One of the investigators who reviewed the recordings said she appeared to say the same phrase several times. The phrase was described as something like, "It was just standing there looking at me," though the audio quality at that point made a definitive transcription impossible. After that morning, the footage and audio becomes increasingly fragmented. There are large gaps. Portions of the recording appear to have been deleted or recorded over, though investigators could not determine whether this was done intentionally or was a result of equipment malfunction. What remains shows increasing deterioration in the group's composure. Thomas appears on camera looking exhausted and frightened. Paul at one point speaks directly to the camera and says they have been trying to leave for 2 days, but the trail keeps putting them back at the cabin. He says this without apparent emotion, as if reporting a simple fact. The phrase "keeps putting them back at the cabin" appears in the transcript and has never been adequately explained. The trail they had used to arrive was a single path. It went one direction in and one direction out. How a trail could repeatedly return 3 adults to their starting point is a question that has no rational answer, and that investigators ultimately documented simply as reported by subject without further analysis. The final audio recording is 17 seconds long. It is Thomas's voice. He is calm. He says, "We figured out that you have to leave before it gets light. We're going to try tonight." And then the recording ends. Thomas Warwick, Paul Gregg, and Jess Alderton were never found. Their families still hold on to the footage that was recovered, not because it answers anything, but because it is the last evidence that they were ever in the world at all. The cabin at the center of Harker's Hollow still stands, or what remains of it does. Nobody has gone back in to document it since. And the local people who have lived in that part of West Virginia for generations continue to maintain the same piece of folk wisdom their grandparents taught them. Don't spend the night in the hollow. They didn't say it without reason. They never do. I want to pause here for a second, because I know that second story is a heavy one. What I want you to take from it, before we move forward, is the detail that Paul mentioned, that the trail kept bringing them back to the cabin. Because that idea that the geography of a place seems to resist your exit comes up again in the third story, differently, but it comes up. And when you start to see a pattern across cases that have no connection to each other, across different states, different times, different groups of people, that's when the hair on the back of your neck is supposed to stand up. That's your body being smarter than your brain. The third story is from the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, in a section of the Cascades that is beautiful in the way that can make you forget it is also extremely dangerous. The Cascades get significant snowfall. They have unpredictable weather systems. They are vast in a way that is genuinely difficult to convey to someone who has not stood in them. Tens of thousands of acres of mountain forest with trail systems that are well mapped in some places and barely mapped at all in others. People go missing in the Cascades every year. Search and rescue teams are some of the most experienced in the country. And even they will tell you that the mountains take people in ways that never fully make sense. In September of 2017, a couple named David and Renata Solis drove up into the Cascades for a week-long stay at a cabin that Renata had found through an online booking platform. They were both in their early 40s. David was a high school history teacher. Renata worked in healthcare administration. They had 2 teenagers at home who stayed with Renata's sister while they were gone. This was an anniversary trip. They had been married for 18 years, and this cabin, remote and beautiful and surrounded by old growth forest, was Renata's idea of a perfect celebration. She had done her research. She had read the reviews on the booking platform. The cabin had a 4.7-star rating with over 60 reviews. People loved it. Several reviewers mentioned the sense of complete peace and total disconnection from the world. One review said, "It was the most healing week of my life." Renata had screenshotted that one and sent it to David. They arrived on a Sunday. The drive up had been long. The last portion on a Forest Service road that was well maintained but required focus. The cabin itself was, by every account, beautiful. Modern amenities in a rustic shell, a good kitchen, comfortable beds. A deck with a view of a mountain valley that on clear days offered a sight that David would later describe as the kind of thing that makes you feel small in the best possible way. They settled in quickly. Renata made a grocery run back to a small market town before it got too late. David started a fire. They had dinner on the deck as the last light left the sky. David took a photo of Renata at dinner, and it's one that, in everything that came after, has become quietly famous in the community of people who follow missing persons cases. She's smiling, holding a glass of wine, the valley dark behind her, and she looks completely and purely happy. For the first 3 days, everything was perfect. They hiked during the days on trails that started almost at the cabin's front door. They cooked together in the evenings. They read. They talked in the way that married people sometimes forget to talk when life gets loud. David said later that by Wednesday, he had felt closer to Renata than he had in years, and that he was already thinking about coming back the following year. Wednesday night is when the thing happened that changed everything. They had gone to bed early after a long hike, both of them tired in the good, physical way that comes from a full day outdoors. David woke up sometime in the middle of the night. He wasn't sure of the exact time, to find Renata's side of the bed empty. He assumed she had gotten up for the bathroom and went back to sleep. When he woke again in the grey pre-dawn light, and she still wasn't there, he got up. She was not in the bathroom. She was not in the kitchen or the living room or on the deck. He called her name, no answer. He put on shoes and went outside. He called her name louder. The forest around the cabin absorbed the sound in the way dense forest does, dampening it almost immediately. He went back inside and checked his phone. No signal. There was a landline in the cabin, and he picked it up, and it was dead, which surprised him. He had not tested it before. He spent the first hour searching the area immediately around the cabin. When he didn't find her, he got in the car and drove to the main road, and then drove until he had enough signal to call 911. He reported Renata missing at approximately 6:15 in the morning. A search team was assembled and on location by early afternoon. They searched for 3 days. They brought in dogs. They used a helicopter. They covered every trail in a significant radius around the cabin. They found no trace of Renata Solis, not her shoes, not a piece of clothing, not a footprint that led anywhere. It was as if she had walked out of the cabin and into nothing. But here is the detail that separates this case from a straightforward disappearance, and the detail that has stayed with the people who followed it. On the second day of the search, one of the search and rescue team members, a woman with many years of experience in the Cascades, went back to the cabin to review the area more carefully. She found something on the cabin's interior wall, near the back door, the door that led to a small mudroom and then to the outside. She found, written in what appeared to be pencil, a series of words, not scratched in, not carved in, written lightly in small, careful letters, as if someone had taken their time. The words were, "I can hear it below the floor. It's been there since we got here. I don't think we were ever alone." Those words were not there when David and Renata arrived. David confirmed this. The property management company confirmed it too. No previous guest had ever reported or described those words, and the cabin had been inspected and cleaned before David and Renata's arrival. The words were not in Renata's handwriting. David confirmed that definitively, but the most unsettling part was the pronoun. We don't think we were ever alone. If Renata had written it, she was referring to herself and David. But David had not seen those words and had not known about whatever she had heard, which means Renata, in whatever state she was in when she wrote those words, believed she was alone. And the we she was writing about may not have been herself and her husband at all. The words were photographed and documented, and then the lead investigator did something that has troubled people ever since. He had the wall repainted before David could take a photograph with his own phone. The official explanation was that the markings were determined to be pre-existing graffiti and not relevant to the investigation. David Solis has contested this account every time he has been asked about it, which is not infrequently, because Renata's disappearance has never been solved, and David has never stopped looking for answers. There is a detail from this case that comes from a source I want to be careful about describing, because it gets into territory that even seasoned investigators find uncomfortable. One of the search and rescue members, off the record and years after the fact, mentioned that on the first night of the search, when the team had set up a small base camp near the cabin, several members had reported hearing something, a sound coming from below, from underground, like something moving in the earth beneath the cabin floor. They mentioned it to each other, and then nobody talked about it again, because they were professionals, and that was not the kind of thing that went into a professional report. But they heard it. They all heard it. And the search and rescue member, who eventually talked about it, said that the moment they heard it, every one of them understood, on a level below language, that Renata Solis was not going to be found. David Solis lives in a different state now. His teenagers are adults. He has a small blog where he writes about Renata and the investigation, and the things he has found or not found in the years of looking. He has filed multiple public records requests. He has hired a private investigator. He has reached out to the previous guests who left reviews on the booking platform, trying to find anyone who experienced anything strange. He found one. A couple who had stayed at the cabin 2 years before him and Renata. They told him that on their third night there, they had both woken up simultaneously at 3 in the morning to the sound of something moving beneath the floorboards. They had assumed it was an animal. A raccoon or possum had gone back to sleep and had thought nothing more of it until David called them. The wife told David that reading about Renata had made her physically ill, because she remembered what it had felt like in that moment, lying there in the dark, listening to the thing under the floor move. She said it hadn't sounded like an animal. She said it had sounded patient. We're going to get to the 4th story very soon, and I want you to know that the 4th one is the one that I have personally found hardest to sit with, because it involves the most witnesses, the most documentation, and the most inexplicable outcome of any of the 4. But before we get there, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something. These 4 stories exist within a larger landscape of disappearances in remote areas of the United States that researchers and investigators have been quietly tracking for decades. The number of people who go missing in national forests, state forests, and wilderness areas every year is significantly higher than the numbers that tend to make headlines, and the proportion of those cases that are never solved. No body found, no definitive cause established, is striking in a way that most people don't fully appreciate until they start digging. This is something that the community here at Faith and Fear takes seriously, because these are real people. These are real families, and the least we can do is remember them by telling their stories as honestly as we can. The 4th story begins in 2019 in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, in an area known for its extreme remoteness, its deeply carved valleys, and its rivers. The Ozarks have their own flavor of wilderness. Unlike the open sky of the Cascades or the dense northern Minnesota forest, the Ozarks feel close. The trees press in. The valleys are deep and shadowed. The light in there, even on a clear day, is filtered and particular. People who love the Ozarks describe it as a landscape with a personality, which is either a beautiful thing to say about a place or an ominous one, depending on your experience of it. In the summer of 2019, a church group from Memphis, Tennessee organized a retreat at a large cabin in the Arkansas Ozarks. The group consisted of 12 adults, 6 couples ranging in age from late 20s to early 60s. They were members of a mid-sized non-denominational church, and this retreat was intended as a combination of spiritual renewal, community building, and simply a chance to get away together. The cabin was large, designed to accommodate groups. It had multiple bedrooms, a great room with a long communal dining table, a full kitchen, and a wide back porch that looked out over a wooded hillside sloping down to a creek. They had rented it through a company that specialized in group retreats and had used the company before for a previous trip that had gone perfectly. The organizer of the retreat, a woman we'll call Carol, had spoken at length with the company's representative and had received detailed information about the property, the surrounding area, and the amenities. What she had not been told, and what the company later claimed they did not know, was that the property had a history. A history that local Ozark residents were well aware of, but that had never made it into any formal documentation associated with the property. The history was this. In the 1930s, a family had lived on that land. The family's name was Draker. They had a small farmstead, not a cabin, but a working farm. In 1938, something happened on the Draker property. The accounts of exactly what are varied and incomplete, because they have been passed down through oral history rather than written record. But the consistent elements are these. The Draker family, which consisted of a husband, wife, and 3 children, were found by a neighbor in the spring of 1938 inside their farmhouse. The neighbor had become concerned because he hadn't seen any of them for several weeks. What he found when he went in is not something that the oral history describes in clear terms. What it does say is that the neighbor, a man named Calvin Peer, came out of that house and walked the 3 miles to town and was never the same again. He refused to say what he had found inside. He lived another 14 years and by all accounts never discussed it once. The farmhouse was burned down by the county sometime in 1939. The land sat empty for decades. At some point in the 1980s, a cabin was built on the property by a developer who was presumably unaware of or unconcerned by its history. Carol and her group arrived on a Thursday afternoon in July. The drive had been pleasant. The cabin was large and well equipped, and everyone was in good spirits. They unloaded the cars, chose their rooms, and gathered on the back porch while a few of the group members started preparing dinner. The evening was warm. The woods behind the cabin were lush and green, and the creek at the bottom of the hillside made the soft sound that moving water makes, constant and reassuring. The group held a brief opening devotional on the porch as the sun went down. Then they went inside for dinner. By 10 o'clock, most of them were in bed. The first night passed without incident. Friday was a full day of activities, hiking in the morning, a period of group discussion and reflection in the afternoon, free time in the evening. 2 of the younger couples walked down to the creek in the late afternoon and reported that it was beautiful. Clear water over smooth stones, with a shelf of rock on one side that made a natural seat above the water. Everyone was relaxed. Dinner that night was festive. Someone had brought a guitar. They sang, they talked. Carol would later say that Friday night was one of the most genuinely joyful evenings she could remember in years. By midnight, the cabin was quiet. Everyone was asleep. The creek could be heard faintly through the open windows. Saturday morning is where everything changed. It changed quietly at first, the way the most serious things often do. The first thing Carol noticed was that 2 members of the group were not at breakfast. A couple, we'll call them Raymond and Diane, who were in their late 40s and who had been among the most energetic participants the day before. Carol assumed they had slept in and didn't think much of it initially. But by 10 o'clock they still had not appeared. And when she knocked on their bedroom door, there was no answer. She opened the door. The room was empty. The bed had been slept in, but they were gone. Their phones, their wallets, their shoes were all still in the room. Carol found this concerning enough to gather the rest of the group and begin searching the property. They searched for an hour. They called names. They went down to the creek. They checked every room of the cabin and every outbuilding. Raymond and Diane were not there. Carol used the cabin's landline to call the rental company, who told her to call local law enforcement. She did. Deputies arrived within the hour. While they were waiting for law enforcement, a second disappearance was discovered. Another member of the group, a man we'll call Franklin, who was in his mid-50s, had gone to check the back porch for a jacket he'd left there the night before. He did not return. The group, now alarmed in a way that was approaching panic, went looking for him. He was not on the porch. He was not in the yard. He was not on the path to the creek. He had vanished in the interval between walking out the back door and the approximately 8 minutes it took for someone to go and check on him. When the deputies arrived and were briefed on the situation, one of them, a younger officer who had grown up in the area, asked Carol a question that she has thought about many times since. He asked her if anyone in the group had gone into the basement. Carol told him the cabin didn't have a basement. The deputy looked at her for a moment and then said that it did, and that the entrance was under the kitchen. A hatch in the floor that was covered by a large braided rug. Carol had not known this. None of the group had known this. The rental company had not mentioned it. She and the deputy went to the kitchen together and pulled back the rug, and there was the hatch, a wooden panel set into the floor with a recessed iron ring. The deputy pulled it open. What happened next has been told in multiple accounts by multiple people who were there, and the accounts are consistent enough that I want to try to describe it carefully. When the hatch was opened, a smell came up from below. The people who have described it say it was like nothing they had encountered before. Not rotting flesh, not mildew, not anything biological that they could name. Several people described it as cold, like the smell of cold stone. But underneath that, or threaded through it, something else. Something that one woman described as like the smell of a held breath. Like something had been breathing down there in the dark and had stopped when the hatch opened. The deputy shone his flashlight down into the space below. It was a low, wide space, dirt-floored, with old stone walls. It appeared to go back quite far, further than the foundation of the cabin would suggest. The deputy called into it. His voice went in and did not come back. He did not go down into the basement. He called for backup. When additional officers arrived, a pair of them went down with full equipment. They moved through the basement, which extended approximately 60 feet back from the hatch opening, and then turned. Around the turn, they found something. What they found is documented in the official report as evidence of recent habitation, which is language so carefully chosen that it almost hides its own meaning. What the report describes, if you read it closely enough, is a space that had been arranged, not randomly, arranged. There were marks on the dirt floor in a pattern that one officer described in his notes as concentric, meaning circles within circles, and at the center of the arrangement, 3 objects were found. A shoe belonging to Raymond, a watch belonging to Diane, a jacket belonging to Franklin. The jacket Franklin had gone to retrieve from the porch. It was in a basement that Franklin had not known existed, in a space that no one in the cabin had known existed, and it was there, clean and folded, at the center of a pattern in the dirt, as if it had been placed there by someone who had all the time in the world. Raymond and Diane and Franklin were not in the basement. The basement had no exit other than the hatch. The remaining 9 members of the group were evacuated from the cabin that afternoon by law enforcement, who then sealed the property. A full investigation was conducted over the following weeks. Forensic teams examined the basement. They identified the marks on the floor as consistent with hand-drawn geometric patterns. They could not identify the author. They could not explain how a shoe, a watch, and a jacket belonging to 3 people who had disappeared from the cabin ended up in a sealed basement that those people did not know existed. Raymond, Diane, and Franklin were never found, but the story doesn't end there. Because 3 months after the disappearances, one of the remaining group members, a woman we'll call Patricia, had an experience that she reported to the investigating detectives, and that was added to the case file. Patricia lived in Memphis. She had returned to her normal life after the retreat, though she described being severely and persistently disturbed by what had happened. She was walking home from work one evening in October when she passed a man on the sidewalk who stopped and looked at her. She didn't recognize him. He was middle-aged, unremarkable looking, except that he was barefoot on a city sidewalk in October. She noticed his feet and looked up at his face, and he said something to her. She told the detectives what he said, and what he said is in the case file. And the detectives documented it without comment. He said they're still in the house. They just can't find the door from that side. Patricia crossed the street, and when she looked back, the man was gone. She reported this immediately. The detectives noted it. The investigation into his identity went nowhere. And the phrase he said to her, "They're still in the house. They just can't find the door from that side," has lived in the minds of everyone connected to this case ever since. Because what it implies, if you sit with it long enough, is a geography that we don't have the language to properly describe. A place that is adjacent to our own, and that you can fall into but cannot fall back out of. A place where people who are loved and missed are still walking around, still looking for a way home, still unable to find the door. I have to be honest with you. That detail, that single sentence from a barefoot stranger on a Memphis sidewalk, is the thing that cost me the most sleep when I was putting this together. Not the footage from the hollow, not the sound under the floor in the Cascades. That one sentence. Because it suggests a kind of horror that doesn't operate on physical laws. A horror that isn't about violence or predation or even death, but about displacement. About being taken out of the world you know and put just slightly sideways of it, close enough to see through but not to cross back. That is a horror for which we have no category and no remedy and no rescue protocol. Let me come back up for a moment, because I want to talk about the patterns that connect these 4 stories before we go any further, because I think the patterns are part of what makes this material so genuinely unsettling. Pattern 1. In every one of these 4 cases, there was a warning. The email about the marked paths in Minnesota. The folklore about the hollow that the West Virginia locals had been passing down for generations. The words on the wall in the Washington cabin, written by someone in pencil carefully, as if they wanted someone to find it and understand. And the history of the Draker property in Arkansas, which existed in the community's memory, but never made it onto paper. Never made it into the booking company's literature. Never made it anywhere that would have reached Carol and her group in time. Someone always knew. The warnings always existed. They just weren't where the people who needed them could find them. Pattern 2. The thing that comes to the cabin, in every case, moves slowly. It doesn't rush. It doesn't smash through doors. It circles. It waits. It stands at the tree line for 17 minutes. It moves below the floor. Patiently, it makes the trail loop back. It opens the hatch from the inside and arranges things carefully at the center of a pattern. Whatever these things are, they are not in a hurry, and that patience, that absolute lack of urgency, is maybe the most frightening thing about all 4 of these accounts, because it implies a confidence, an absolute certainty that what they are waiting for is going to happen. Pattern 3. The missing leave without their shoes. Raymond's shoe was in the basement. Renata's shoes were still in the cabin. The missing in the Minnesota cabin left without any indication of deliberate departure. It is as though whatever takes people in these places does not allow for preparation. It does not give you the moment to grab your phone, to put on your coat, to take anything with you. It takes you immediately and completely, mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-step. There is a researcher who has spent a significant portion of their career looking at patterns in remote area disappearances in North America. They have published some of their findings through academic channels and have discussed the rest in interviews. I won't name them because their academic position has made them careful about public associations with what they call anomalous case clusters, but they have described, in several interviews, a category of disappearance that doesn't fit the standard models. Not exposure, not predatory crime, not accident, not voluntary departure. Cases where the physical evidence is inconsistent with any of those explanations. Cases where trained search dogs lose the scent trail in a location where there is no logical reason for it to stop. Cases where aerial searches of areas that should be visible reveal nothing. Cases where the missing person was last seen in a location that they could not have left undetected by those present. This researcher calls these cases edge cases, and they estimate that they account for a small but statistically notable percentage of all remote area disappearances annually. A small percentage of a large number is still a large number, and those are real people, real families, real empty chairs at tables that were set for one more person. I want to spend a moment on the families, because this is the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Marcus's parents in Minnesota have never officially accepted that their son is dead. They have continued to mark his birthday. His mother has a website where she posts any new information about the case as it emerges, which it rarely does, but she maintains it anyway. That kind of persistence is not denial. It is love in the absence of any other option. Thomas Warwick's sister has been one of the few family members who has spoken publicly and consistently about the West Virginia case. She has advocated for better protections for filmmakers working in remote areas and has pushed, unsuccessfully so far, for the complete documentation in her brother's case to be reviewed by an independent panel. Renata Solis's 2 children are adults now, and from what David Solis has shared on his blog, they carry the absence of their mother in ways that don't get better over time, only different. And the families of the 3 people who vanished from the Arkansas retreat have largely stayed out of public view, dealing with a loss that has no grave, no explanation, and no end. This is what Faith and Fear is about, at its core. Not just the horror of these events, though the horror is real and we don't minimize it, but the human weight of them. The weight that doesn't get lighter. The questions that don't get answered. The people who go to sleep every night in houses where someone used to be, and who have learned to live alongside an absence that never fully fills in. Let's go back to the Minnesota case one more time, because there is an element of it that I deliberately held back to come back to, because it fits better here, after everything else we've discussed. Sarah, the sole survivor of that group, the woman who braced her door and lay still in the dark and did not move, gave an interview several years after the disappearances to a researcher who was working on a book about remote area mysteries. In that interview, she described something she had never discussed publicly before. She said that at some point in the night, while she was lying still in her room, she heard a voice, not outside the cabin, inside, in the main room. She said it was a voice she recognized. She said it sounded like Marcus. It said her name once, clearly and calmly, the way a friend says your name to get your attention. Just her name, nothing else. She did not respond. She did not move. She lay completely still and stared at the ceiling and did not make a single sound. And then the voice did not come again. She told the researcher that she believes, and she used the word believes very deliberately. She believes that if she had responded, if she had said yes, or called his name back, or opened her door, she would have gone the same way the others did. She believes the voice was not Marcus. She believes the voice was whatever was outside the cabin, using a sound it had learned to make, trying to get her to open the door. That is one of the most disturbing things I have ever come across in the research I do for this channel. Not because it's graphic or violent, but because of what it implies about these things. It implies learning, adaptation, a strategy that involves mimicry, an understanding of human emotional vulnerability, specific enough to choose the right voice. These are not the qualities of a mindless predator. These are the qualities of something that has been watching long enough to understand what will make you open the door. And if that doesn't make you want to keep the lights on tonight, I genuinely don't know what will. There is a broader context I want to put these stories in before we start moving toward the close of tonight's video. And I want to be careful about how I frame this, because I don't want to veer into territory that isn't supported by what we actually know. But what we actually know is genuinely extensive and genuinely unsettling, so I don't think I need to embellish anything. The United States has a missing persons problem that is not fully understood by the general public. Each year, hundreds of thousands of people are reported missing. The vast majority of those cases are resolved. People are found, cases are closed, explanations are established. But a subset of those cases, disproportionately concentrated in wilderness and remote rural areas, remain permanently open. No cause determined, no remains found, no evidence of what happened. Organizations that study these patterns have noted certain recurring features. High concentrations in particular geographic areas. Clusters of cases that recur in the same locations across years and decades. Consistent patterns in the physical evidence, or lack thereof, across cases that have no apparent connection to each other. The official position of most agencies is that these patterns reflect the inherent dangers of remote wilderness environments and the difficulty of conducting searches in those environments. And that is, of course, a reasonable position. It is consistent with what we know about wilderness, about human vulnerability, about the limits of search and rescue. It is a reasonable position. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why search dogs lose the trail in the middle of an open field. It doesn't explain why the footage from Harker's Hollow shows something standing at the tree line for 17 minutes. It doesn't explain the words written on the wall in the Washington cabin, or what was moving below that floor, or why a shoe and a watch and a folded jacket ended up in a sealed basement in Arkansas, arranged at the center of a pattern that no one could identify. Reasonable explanations are good things. They are important things, but they are not the only things. I've been doing this for a while now, researching these cases, putting together these stories, bringing them to you here on Faith and Fear. And one of the things I've noticed, across all the research I've done, is that the people who are most dismissive of these cases, the people who are fastest to reach for the rational explanation and hold on to it, are almost always people who have never spent a night alone in a truly isolated place. People who have never lain awake in a dark cabin listening to the forest outside, becoming aware in some very old, very deep part of themselves that there are things in the dark that the dark keeps from them. There is a reason that every human culture in the history of the world has stories about what lives in the wilderness. There is a reason the warnings exist. There is a reason the old people in every community, in every culture, in every era, have said don't go into the deep places after dark. Don't answer the voice you don't recognize. Don't go where the path stops. Don't open the door when you don't know what's on the other side. These warnings were not invented for entertainment. They were not invented to keep children from wandering. They were passed down because they are the accumulated knowledge of what happens when people don't listen to them. They were passed down by people who had seen, or who had lost someone who didn't listen. And they were passed down because the truth in them is permanent. The cabin in northern Minnesota is still there. The abandoned cabin at the center of Harker's Hollow in West Virginia is still there. The retreat cabin in the Arkansas Ozarks has been taken off the rental market, but the building still stands. The cabin in the Washington Cascades was eventually taken off the booking platform too, quietly, without explanation. About 8 months after Renata Solis disappeared. It is still there. All of them still there, sitting at the end of their roads in their clearings, in their hollows, in their mountain valleys, waiting in the particular way that places wait, passive and permanent and patient. I want to read you something. It's a message I received through the Faith and Fear community from someone who reached out after we covered a previous missing person's story. I'm sharing it with permission, and I'm going to keep it anonymous because that's what was requested. The message said, I'm a former park ranger. I worked in a national forest in the southeast for 12 years. In that time, I was involved in 8 search and rescue operations for missing persons. 6 of those 8 cases were resolved. 2 were not. Of those 2 unresolved cases, both had the same quality to the search that I've never been able to describe adequately to anyone who wasn't there. It wasn't that we couldn't find them. It was that the search itself felt wrong, like the ground wasn't telling the truth, like the forest was showing us a version of itself that wasn't complete. I don't have a better way to say it than that. The ground wasn't telling the truth. I thought about that for a long time after I left the service. I still think about it. I don't know what it means, but it felt true, and it felt important, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't leave you. The ground wasn't telling the truth. I find that phrase more evocative than almost anything I've come across in this research, because it captures the specific quality of wrongness that comes up again and again in accounts from people who were present at these searches. Not the wrongness of something obviously bad, something that you can point to and say there, that's the problem. But the wrongness of something subtly false, a reality that is slightly off from what it should be, like a note played almost correctly, almost but not quite. And that not quite-ness, barely detectable but persistently present, is what these people are describing. when they struggle to explain what these searchers felt like from the inside. The ground wasn't telling the truth. The trail kept bringing them back. The smell like a held breath. The voice that knew their name. There are things in this world that our systems, our frameworks, our categories, our institutions were not built to accommodate. And I think that the people who go into isolated places and don't come back, and the people who search for them and come away with a specific unnameable sense of wrongness, have all encountered, in different ways, the edge of what those systems can handle. And what is on the other side of that edge, what is on the other side of what we can name and categorize and explain, is where the real darkness lies. Not the darkness of ignorance, the darkness of knowing that there is something that you cannot know, the darkness of understanding that the map ends and the territory keeps going. I want to come back to something I said near the beginning of tonight's video, because I think it deserves to be said again more carefully. There is something about a cabin in the woods that pulls at us, that ancient pull. And I don't think that pull is accidental or arbitrary. I think it exists because something in us recognizes that the wilderness is where the truth lies. The real truth, the wild truth. The truth that does not conform to our categories or defer to our frameworks. And that recognition is both what draws us to those places and what makes those places dangerous. Because the truth, the actual truth about what this world contains and what shares it with us, is not something our modern minds were fully designed to hold. We built our cities and our systems and our institutions precisely to keep that truth at a comfortable distance. And the cabin, the isolated cabin at the end of the road, is the place where that distance collapses, where you are close enough to the wild truth to hear it breathing. Below the floor, outside the window, walking slowly around the perimeter, waiting patient. Absolutely certain that you are going to hear it eventually, and that when you do, you will open the door. Don't open the door. That's the lesson of all four of these stories, if there is a single lesson. Sarah survived because she didn't open the door. She didn't respond to the voice. She didn't move when the sound circled the cabin. She held still, and she held on, and she lived. And the four people she went into those woods with did not. We don't know whether they opened the door. We don't know whether they were taken without being given a choice. We don't know what happened in those dark hours in that cabin at the end of the 6-mile dirt road, and we probably never will. But Sarah, who was in that cabin, who heard what circled in the dark, who heard her own name spoken in a dead man's voice, Sarah believes that the door is the thing, that the door is always the threshold, that on the other side of the door, in the particular dark of particular isolated places, there is something that knows your name and knows your voice and knows exactly what sound will make you want to come out. And she believes that the decision to not go, to not respond, to stay completely still in the complete dark and breathe and wait for morning is the decision that determines everything. Breathe and wait for morning. I keep coming back to that. As a piece of advice for a horror story, it's almost too simple. But simplicity is sometimes where the deepest wisdom lies. In a world that is always telling us to engage, to respond, to move, to act, to go toward the sound.